message is being transmitted at the request of the Office of Civil Defense. This is an emergency broadcast. This is not a test.
Our world is on the brink of a third world war, the likes of which have never been seen in human history. This looming global war will make the first two world wars pale in comparison. Does the Bible mention a third world war, a nuclear warfare in prophecy? Now, approximately 27% of the Bible is prophecy. Some of the predominant prophetic books include Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Revelation. In this four-part series, I will be looking at what each of these four main prophetic books have to say about a near future third world war and nuclear warfare. These four books, in particular, all contain prophecy that seem to point toward major end times wars and events. Next, in part 2, we will discuss the book of Isaiah, in particular chapters 2 and 24. We will begin with chapter 2, and this is what Isaiah, son of Amos, says concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mount of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Verse 3 goes on to say, many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Verse 4 goes on to say that he will judge between the nations, and he will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Verse 5, come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. This sounds like the restoration of Israel after the 7-year tribulation. But I want to get into verse 6, where it begins describing the day of the Lord. In verse 6, you, Lord, have abandoned your people, the descendants of Jacob. They are full of superstitions from the east. They practice divination like the Philistines and embrace pagan customs. Their land is full of silver and gold. There is no end to their treasures. Their land is full of horses. There is no end to their chariots. Their land is full of idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their fingers have made. So people will be brought low and everyone humbled. Do not forgive them. Verse 10 goes on to state that, go into the rocks, hide in the ground from the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty. The eyes of the arrogant will be humbled, and human pride brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. Verse 12, the Lord Almighty has a day in store for all the proud and lofty, for all that is exalted, and they will be humbled. Verse 13, for all the cedars of Lebanon, tall and lofty, and all the oaks of Bashan, for all the towering mountains, and all the high hills, for every lofty tower, and every fortified wall, for every trading ship, and every stately vessel. Verse 17, the arrogance of man will be brought low, and human pride humbled. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day, and the idols will totally disappear. People will flee to caves in the rocks and to holes in the ground from the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he rises to shake the earth. Verse 20, in that day people will throw away to the moles and bats their idols of silver and idols of gold, which they made to worship. Verse 21, they will flee to caverns in the rocks and to the overhanging crags from the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he rises to shake the earth. Verse 22, stop trusting in mere humans who have but a breath in their nostrils. Why hold them in esteem? Did you notice in verse 10 how it says, go into the rocks, hide in the ground from the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty? Verse 19 goes on to say, people will flee to caves in the rocks and to holes in the ground from the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty, when he rises to shake the earth. Verse 21 stated that they will flee to caverns in the rocks and to the overhanging crags from the fearful presence of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty, when he rises to shake the earth. Now, in summary, in verses 10, 19, and 21, it mentions 3 different times how people are hiding below the ground, in the rocks and in the caves. Does this not sound like people escaping to fallout bunkers and shelters? Could it be that people are escaping below ground and into bunkers to escape God's wrath and nuclear fallout and possibly a global war? Now, chapter 2 is simply one of many painting a prophetic picture of nuclear annihilation and a possible global war. Chapter 24 of Isaiah states in verses 1 through 3, "See, the Lord is going to lay waste the earth and devastate it. He will ruin its face and scatter its inhabitants. It will be the same for priest as for people, for the master as for his servant, for the mistress as for her servant, for seller as for buyer, for borrower as for lender, for debtor as for creditor. The earth will be completely laid waste and totally plundered. The Lord has spoken this word." Verse 6 states, "Therefore a curse consumes the earth. Its people must bear their guilt. Therefore earth's inhabitants are burned up, and very few are left." Verse 10 states, "The ruined city lies desolate. The entrance to every house is barred." And finally, verse 12 states, "The city is left in ruins. Its gate is battered to pieces." Notice how the prophecy states in verse 1 that the Lord is going to lay waste the earth and devastate it. It says again in verse 3, the earth will be completely laid waste and totally plundered. Verse 6 is very interesting, how it states that earth's inhabitants are burned up and very few are left. Verses 10 and 12 describe the desolation of cities throughout the earth. Desolate cities, people burned up with fire, survivors hiding in the rocks and earth. When matched with the book of Ezekiel and other books, does it start to paint a prophetic picture of global annihilation through world war and nuclear warfare? Stick around for parts 3 and 4 as we connect the dots and unveil the ancient prophecies as they describe the future of our world. If you do not know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, I encourage you to seek him now, before the rapture of the church and the start of the Great Tribulation, because we're on the cusp of all these things. Prophetic signs are everywhere, indicating the nearness of the hour. Now, I encourage you to read Romans 10:9 if you do not have salvation. Romans 10:9 states, "If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." Do so today. Seek salvation today before it's too late. And if you have any prayer requests, please leave them in the comments below, and I will respond and pray for you. Until next time, American Watchman out.